Well, welcome everybody to the latest KET webinar. I'm Rob Lyman, and we're going to have a fantastic session tonight with Nigel Warwick. Very, very pleased to have Nigel with us. And we're just going to wait a few minutes. There have been a few glitches, partly my responsibility at the start. As you all join, just give us a few minutes as we make sure that people have got the right connections and links and so on. But we've got about 180 people, I think, so far signed up for tonight's webinar, which is really exciting. And I was very disappointed to miss the last one. I was actually in the Far East myself, spending 6 weeks wandering around the battlefields. So it's nice to be home and nice to be sat at my desk ready for this one. And as ever, we've got lots of people from all around the world joining, which is really exciting. Darren, welcome back, Darren. You are the stalwart of the show, and we've got people from Australia because Nigel's ringing in from Australia tonight, dialing in, whatever you call it, and this is going to be fantastic. Should we just give it a few more seconds? Sylvia, you ready?
Oh, we're good. I think we're good to go. Hello, everyone.
Ready to go. So I'll hand over to Sylvia to get us started.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rob. And hello, everyone. And welcome once again to another Kohima Educational Trust webinar. And we're over 100 tonight actually watching live, which is absolutely fantastic. So thank you all. And it's lovely to have you all with us. And tonight we will hear about the role of the RAF Regiment in Burma between 1942 and 46. And we know well that Viscount Slim said that without the Air Force, the 14th Army could never have defeated the Japanese in Burma. But perhaps less discussed is that the RAF commanders themselves considered that air power might not have remained viable without its own force protection, provided mainly by the RAF Regiment. A dedicated and specialised ground force for active defence of airfields, the regiment played a vital part in the success of the Burma campaign. It was formed in 1942, and they spent the next 3 years deployed throughout the region, most notably Imphal. By March 45, the regiment participated in the masterstroke of the campaign, the thrust for and capture of Meiktila. The new corps earned acclaim in the defence of Meiktila airfield, which is considered to be the most important battle it has ever fought to this day. Dr Nigel Warwick is uniquely placed to take us through these 4 years, having written a marvellous book from which we have borrowed the title this evening, Constant Vigilance, RAF Regiment in the Burma Campaign. And you can see a copy behind Nigel on his bookshelf. And I'll have hopefully copies to sell later on our online shop. And do let me know if you would like a copy and I will get one for you. Nigel is an Australian academic and also the core historian of the RAF Regiment. He is also a member of the Executive Council Corps Memorial Garden at the National Memorial Arboretum. He also lives in Canberra, as Rob has just alluded to, so we are most grateful to him for his very early start. Good morning, Nigel. Good morning. We're delighted as always to have the wonderful Rob Lyman back from his travels in Nagaland and Burma. We've missed you. As ever, do use the chat and Q&A buttons, everybody, and any questions Rob and Nigel will be happy to reply to at the end. And now, as always, I'll hand over to Rob, who will introduce the evening for us. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Sylvia. Well, you are all dab hands at this now. You know what to do. Just stick something in chat or Q&A, and I will follow it, I hope, throughout the session. And at the end, when Nigel comes to an end, we'll spend a bit of time answering questions. If we can't tonight for any reason, then we will deal with them by email and put them on the website subsequently. Well, I'm delighted to welcome Nigel to this webinar tonight. I first came across Nigel perhaps 20 years ago when I was actually writing a book about the security situation in Iraq in 1941. And those of you who will know RAF history will recognize that the RAF was given the responsibility for security in Iraq in the 1920s. And of course, where planes go, security needs to accompany them on the ground, hence the arrival of the RAF Regiment. And Nigel's written on that subject. But I'm particularly pleased to be able to welcome Nigel tonight. And he's going to take us through the story of the regiment in Burma. I often think to myself, when I think I know quite a lot about the Burma campaign, something like the RAF Regiment comes along and disabuses me, because there's a huge amount that we still don't know about the Burma campaign. There are very few PhD students studying the subject, well, one or two, and very few academics or writers actually putting any serious time into it. And I think there's a huge amount more that we can learn. And the role of the RAF Regiment, we did a rehearsal last night, and I was absolutely flabbergasted to hear some of the statistics that Nigel's going to talk to us tonight about. So, and I hope you're going to be as flabbergasted tonight as I was yesterday. Well, that's enough from me. Delighted to welcome you, Nigel, and I'm going to hand the show over to you.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Thank you, Rob and Sylvia, for this opportunity to talk about the Royal Air Force Regiment. In this webinar, I'll talk to you about what the RAF Regiment is, the reasons behind its formation, and most importantly for this group, the important role that the regiment had in the Burma campaign, pretty much unknown until I wrote my book. This scene depicted here on the slide here occurred 80 years ago, almost to the day. What I'm going to read to you is taken directly from the words of the men who were there. As the first glimmer of dawn touched the distant hills, 30 or so men with rifles and brens at the ready climbed out of trenches and made their way through a barbed wire apron before cautiously heading off across the baked red soil to a dusty airstrip. There was no cover on the airstrip and only a few patches of short, dry scrub around the edges and in a belt between two parallel runways. The only significant building was a small shell-damaged pagoda, the bells of which still rang softly in the light breeze. An abandoned steamroller lay on its side, some distance away, and a Dakota lay broken and smouldering in the near distance. The men spread out and began a sweep of the airstrip and its perimeter. Every ditch, slit trench, and patch of scrub had to be examined. They were searching for Japanese soldiers who had infiltrated onto the airstrip and its surrounds during the night. In the darkness, they had heard the enemy moving around their positions, digging themselves into new strong points, or crawling in close and trying to draw fire from the British, Indian, Gurkha, and American defenders. The patrol would take just over 2 hours to complete the task, but this was the only sure method to ensure it was safe for aircraft to land. The transport aircraft were most vulnerable to ground fire on takeoff and landing, and the capacity of the airstrip to take aircraft would be strangled if the flight paths were not cleared of hostile forces. It was March 1945, and the airstrip was located east of a town called Meiktila on the central plain of Burma. These men were not soldiers of the British Indian Army. They were airmen of the Royal Air Force Regiment, a corps which has only been in existence for just over 3 years and is still in existence today. These men were playing a vital part in what is considered the masterstroke of the Burma campaign and which would break the back of the Japanese army in Burma. So how did we get there? Well, this is my uncle Roy Morris, and you'll notice he's actually in the Royal Artillery. He's not in the Royal Air Force Regiment. But the significant thing about my uncle was that when he retired in the 1980s, he started visiting me in Australia and my parents in New Zealand. I'm born in New Zealand, not Australia. Note that, very important. And he knew of my interest in the Burma campaign. And one day, when he visited me one time, he bought a whole box of his Deco magazines, which is the journal of the Burma Star Association. What amazed me about that magazine was you could open up, although the articles were interesting, what was even more fascinating, there were the contact details for various unit associations and reunions. These people were still alive. I came across an article which recounted, albeit briefly, the story of the Royal Air Force Regiment in Burma. I'd been spending some years trying to find out what the Royal Air Force Regiment did, not only in Burma, but anywhere else. And those of you in the regiment will know that very little has been written about it. What piqued my interest about Burma, though, was that by the end of the campaign, there were some 30 squadrons, and remember a squadron is about 120 to 160 men, had served in India. That's more than 4,000 gunners, the equivalent of a large brigade in terms of army numbers. The question was, where was their story? And this has set me on a path that has occupied me for the last 30 years or more. Next thing was that I wrote to the Royal Air Force Regiment Southeast Asia Command Association. They'd formed in the early 1980s, and that was formed of veterans of the Royal Air Force Regiment who'd served across Southeast Asia Command from India across to Singapore and so on. I wrote to a chap called Henry Kirk, who's shown here at a very young age in 1941, before he went out to the Far East. And there's another picture with him and Margaret when he received his MBE. I was writing to Henry saying that I was scoping out material for a book on the Royal Air Force Regiment and asked if he could provide me with information on the regiment, in particular in Burma. The response came back, and he immediately activated the membership of the association to provide letters and photos. The interesting thing about Henry was he'd served in India and Burma from 1942 and in the same squadron from its formation until its disbandment. He'd suffered numerous tropical diseases, been bitten by a snake, run over in Calcutta by a jeep driven by some drunk US pilots who'd been flying the hump. So he was lucky to be talking to me, but he was a fascinating individual. First, though, if we're going to talk about the Royal Air Force Regiment, we have to talk a little bit about the history of the regiment. And we go back before the start of the Second World War. And prior to the start of the Second World War, the Army held responsibility for airfield defence. This was problematic because the resources were allocated according to Army priorities and not those of the Royal Air Force. Military doctrine at the time had failed to appreciate the crucial role that possession and operation of airfields played in the successful outcome of a campaign. In the first 3 years of the war, however, many airfields were lost, including key failures in Crete and in Malaya, and these significantly affected the outcome of the campaign. Following the defeat in France in June 1940, the Royal Air Force decided to take responsibility for ground defence, and it formed what was known as the Ground Defence Branch. These airmen were known as ground gunners, and they were identified by a GG embroidered badge on their sleeve. Their role was to provide defence against air attack, and they operated light anti-aircraft machine guns. This arrangement continued until mid-1941, where after the failures in Crete and actually only a few months later in Malaya, it was decided to call an inquiry under the direction of Sir Finlayter Stewart. The Finlayter Stewart Committee recommended the formation of an aerodrome defence corps of ground combat units under RAF command and control, not Army control. Therefore, the Royal Air Force Regiment was formed on the 1st of February 1942, following the signing of the Royal Warrant by King George VI. The intent expressed by the Air Ministry that this was to be more than just a formation of aerodrome guards standing with Lee Enfield rifles propped up at a gate. The important thing was that the strategic function of the Corps is inherently defensive, but it's essential that it should be trained to act tactically on the offensive, and that its title should be one which will foster a fighting spirit and high morale and not lay emphasis on the defensive role. The airmen were to be drawn from the old ground defence branch. In the United Kingdom, the Corps was responsible for some 590 airfields, with 79,000 airmen. If you think in terms of army units, that's probably the equivalent of 4 divisions. Thousands more ground gunners could also be found out in the Middle East, India, and the Far East. Now, whereas a clear decision had been made to form the Royal Air Force Regiment, the organisation of the ground defence flights, which were these groups of men that had been attached to various parts of the Royal Air Force, but not under any real control, presented problems because they wanted to develop an ethos and an esprit de corps. In the United Kingdom, there were defence squadrons that were easily just converted to Royal Air Force Regiment. They'd existed prior to the establishment of the regiment, and they were converted to what were called field squadrons. In the Middle East, India, and the Far East, The defence flights were still attached to their own flying squadrons, radar units, stores units, air stations, and recovery and salvage units, and there was very little concern of where they could be tactically employed. This structure led to varying levels of training, discipline, and expertise. This was very much dependent on the level of interest, skill, and training of the officer or the NCO who was assigned to command the flight, or indeed a half flight. And when I say a flight, that's about 36 men, and a half flight is 18. Now, if the Allies needed any further affirmation that a dedicated airfield defence force was required, it was given when the Japanese attacked Palembang airfield on the island of Sumatra on the 14th of February 1942. 258 Squadron, which was flying from what was called P1 airfield, was airborne, and it was causing considerable slaughter to the approaching enemy invasion fleet. However, the airfield was attacked by parachute troops. Air Commodore S.F. Vincent, who we'll come across later in Imphal, recently arrived from the United Kingdom, and he was the newly appointed commanding officer of the 226 Fighter Group. He was some distance from P1 in his operations room, and he immediately warned his aerodrome defence officer to expect a paratroop assault. Vincent continues, "It looked like a parachute attack, and I ordered him to issue rifles and ammunition to all immediately." A bit late, I would say. Shortly afterwards, the siren sounded, the guns fired, and the anti-aircraft gun liaison officer looked up from his phone to the guns with a white face, reporting that hundreds of parachutes were coming down all around. Flying Officer Mathis Torta, a South African of the Royal Air Force Regiment, and now remember the regiment had only been in existence for 14 days, had just arrived at P1 with his gunners to relieve the night shift. He immediately led counterattacks with a squadron defence flight of only 20 airmen to drive back the Japanese as they attempted to take control of the airstrip. In his own words, we were in various positions, and then this red flag ran up on the control tower, and probably a few minutes later, we saw aircraft approaching from the north. We thought they were friendly, our own aircraft, and they circled slowly, and then the parachutes began to drop. They fell beyond the perimeter of the airfield. We were between them and the airfield. So I decided the best thing to do was go and find them. George Crowsley, a gunner with Torta, recalled, "Bill Torta's section was a small one. Our small unit, however, had a small satisfaction of making approximately 50 enemy paratroops run like hell from the airfield at Palembang, after Torta ordered us to sell your lives dearly, lads." This was the only force available to defend the strip other than a few Army anti-aircraft gunners. The end result was inevitable as the force was considerably outnumbered. Despite attempting escape by sea, Torta was subsequently taken prisoner, but survived the arduous and brutal imprisonment by the Japanese. In March 1946, after reports of his gallantry at P1 had been reported, he was awarded the Military Cross. Interestingly, Torta was the first RAF Regiment officer to perform an act leading to the award of the Military Cross. Furthermore, his recommendation for the MC was the last gazetted for service during the Second World War, due to his long imprisonment with the Japanese. So we move now from Sumatra and we go over to Burma. And of course, in Burma in 1942, early 1942, the Japanese invaded, and there was very little Air Force resources to repel that invasion. And what I've done here is just taken one example from General Slim's experience. General Slim was arriving to take command of Burkor, and this is recounted in his Defeat into Victory. Arriving around sunset, Slim's Lysander circled the airfield at Magway. Waiting for a signal to land, none was received, so his Sikh pilot landed the plane and taxied up the runway. He found Magway deserted and was able to stroll freely amongst the only remaining RAF fighter aircraft in Burma. Finally, a Burma Rifles truck happened to pass on a nearby road, and Slim hitched a lift into Magway town to find the Royal Air Force Wing headquarters. There he found everyone in good heart and cheer. Slim suggested that it was a bit rash to leave so many aeroplanes on a deserted airfield in the midst of a not too reliable population. He was told that safety of the aircraft was the Army's business. So the British Indian Army retreated back through into India, And immediately, of course, India became the front line for the war against the Japanese in that part of the theatre. So in March 1942, as the Burma Army retreated towards India, there are currently only 2 airfields that were being used operationally in India and only 2 in Ceylon. There was only 1 radar station, and that had been in Burma. There were no plans for anti-aircraft defensive airfields. There was an urgent requirement for a vast expansion of the air forces, and particularly, of course, in the northeast of India, where the Japanese were coming up to the Assam border and Manipur. Reasonably rapid progress was made, and by June 1942, there'd been an increase in the flying squadrons from 5 to 26. Correspondingly, however, there had to be a parallel development of ground defence capability, and that's what we're going to talk about now. With the retreat from Burma ended, India would have to be the location for the development and rebuilding of the air forces that would defend and later recapture Burma. Following an inspection tour of the Royal Air Force Regiment personnel in India by the Air Ministry from London in late 1942, it was reported that most defence flights were badly equipped, and in most places the men were being used as general dog's bodies and were eating their heads off in misemployment. One of the common stories that could be apocryphal is that a lot of Royal Air Force Regiment airmen were being used as barmen in the officers' mess. There was virtually no training, and discipline was poor. According to leading aircraftman Colin Kirby, there are also these well-educated chaps and skilled tradesmen walking around with puzzled expressions. What is this ground defence? It was a relatively unpopular thing to join. A lot of airmen wanted to be aircrew, which is the flash thing to do. And if they didn't have the required technical skills or education, they were often put into ground defence. By July 1943, 18 months after the formation of the RAF Regiment, it was still not clear what the exact strength of ground defence personnel in India was. It fell to the Command Defence Officer, Wing Commander Jack Harris, who's shown here, to pull together a sufficient number of flights to cover the looming operations in the Arakan and elsewhere, from among the more than now 4,500 ground gunners in the command. Harris was born in Melbourne in Australia and had gone to the UK, I think prior to the war. He was eventually the Commandant General of the Royal Air Force Regiment and the first member of the regiment to become the Commandant General. Before that, they'd mostly been pilots. I should add, for those of you, the Royal Air Force Regiment does not consist of people who fly planes. One of the common stories I have is that I say to people, I'm interested in the Royal Air Force Regiment, and they will say, oh yes, my uncle flew Lancasters over Berlin. That's not the Royal Air Force Regiment, that's the Royal Air Force. As a consequence, it was decided to bring together the gunners to one place where they could be trained. And then, so number 1 RAF Regiment Training School was established at Begumpet near Secunderabad in Hyderabad State on the Deccan Plateau. It ensured consistent and higher standards for both anti-aircraft and ground defence. Airmen were trained and then sent back to their respective units, but individually or in small numbers. An RAF Regiment pipe band was even formed with the instruments donated by the Nizam of Hyderabad that considerably added to morale. The month-long course was composed of sessions of weapons training, fieldcraft and fieldworks instruction, anti-gas and artillery classes, including night operations. On November 1942, the course was extended to 6 weeks and included skills in the defence of and the attacking on airfields. By early 1943, additional exercises were being carried out in field signals, the use of cover, machine gun tactics, the individual and section stalk, sentry duty, and fighting patrols. And Rob would be familiar with a lot of these exercises, having been in the infantry. An assault course and a battle inoculation blitz course, which is shown in the photos here, were constructed, which were reputed by some to be the toughest in India. Blue berets were issued, and the RAF Regiment shoulder flashes further added to the growing esprit de corps. On 1st of March 1943, the training school was renamed the RAF Regiment Depot and increased in size and moved to a location a short distance away. Under the new arrangements, the role of the Royal Air Force Regiment Depot would be training, equipping and forming what are called field squadrons and anti-aircraft flights. So rather than training airmen individually in ground defence and sending them to these disparate station or squadron or radar station defence flights, they were going to be formed into these field squadrons that had been formed for the ground defence of airfields, radar stations, which we commonly refer to as Air Ministry Experiment Stations, or AIMS. You'll see this coming up. Wireless stations and other facilities. A field squadron consisted of 6 officers and 150 airmen, and it included an armoured fighting vehicle flight with 7 armoured vehicles. The anti-aircraft flights were to provide local anti-aircraft defence to airfields and consisted of 1 officer and 36 airmen, and they were equipped with the twin Browning air machine guns, 8 of them. Following these formations, it was found that there were surplus airmen, and these were formed into what were called India flights, and they consisted of 1 officer and 36 men that performed a similar function to the field squadrons. Now, the disastrous first Arakan campaign of December 1942 to May 1943 saw RAF regiment flights in the campaign, but they were still attached to these flying squadrons or AIMS units, and they did actually move down the coast of the Arakan, 1 flight nearly reaching Indon before the order to withdraw was given. And you can see on the map the Don Bake down here, and here's Indon. And this is the Arakan coast, those who are familiar with it. By the end of 1943, however, after the first Arakan campaign, there were now 5 field squadrons and 26 anti-aircraft flights deployed to 224 Group, Royal Air Force. This group had the responsibility for air support in the impending second Arakan offensive. George Briggs had spent a few weeks guarding 75 Air Stores Park in India before he was moved to the RAF Regiment Depot, from where he was posted to 2942 Field Squadron, and he experienced a very different thing to guarding an Air Stores Park. Our squadron moved up to Ramu, where Hurricanes were operating, harassing the Japanese and trying to make their airstrips unserviceable. At this time, our squadron were deployed in gun pits for defence of our airstrip. Some days, some of us would help with refuelling of the aircraft. Other times, we went on training exercises or for some practice on the firing range. This involved finding a gully in a safe area and firing a few rounds from a Bren gun. Very rarely a Zero would chase a Hurricane home, which had used up all its ammunition, and then we were able to have a go at him with our Brens. 2944 Field Squadron were dispatched to Maung Daw. We can see Maung Daw here on the map just here. They were on AIMS protection duties and were located between the forward infantry positions and the artillery. Provision of early warning of the approach of any aircraft by these AIMS was essential, as it gave intercepting aircraft time to scramble, climb, and choose their moment of attack. Henry Kirk, who I mentioned earlier, remembers the stay at Maung Daw. When the guns fired, the dugout shook and stones flew about. I slept under an army lorry with orders to destroy the Air Ministry Experiment Station if the Japanese broke through, with a bag of gun cotton explosive. The area was desolate, with charred trees and a terrible stench. 2 graves of our soldiers were on the road edge, marked with sticks and their dog tags, and here we saw the first sight of the horrors of war. Around the time that 2944 Field Squadron had been ordered to Maung Daw, 2945 Field Squadron was sent on a defence task with a more nautical flavour. It was decided to set up an AIMS on St Martin Islands, located 10 miles off the Mayo Peninsula, and you can see it there on the map. That was successfully carried out for a number of months, and again it provided early warning of air attack coming up from the south. Following the second Arakan campaign, the Air Commander of 3rd Tactical Air Force, Air Marshal Sir John Baldwin, made the following comment regarding the conduct of the Royal Air Force Regiment. Units of the Royal Air Force Regiment have proved themselves of the greatest value in this campaign, of which the insecurity of airfields and the warning establishments in forward areas has been a feature. So now we move to the siege of Imphal. So we go from the Arakan coast up into Manipur. As in the Arakan, the Japanese tactics for the attack on as in the Arakan, the Japanese tactics for the attack on Imphal were founded on the encirclement of the enemy, the blocking of road-bound supply lines, and the use of captured supplies to support a further advance. On the Imphal plain, there were large depots, dumps, and administrative elements, hospitals and labour camps. It was therefore an invaluable base for the Allies, but also a coveted prize for the Japanese. Most importantly, there were two all-weather airfields, Imphal Main in the north and Palel in the south, and 4 fair-weather airfields at Kengla, Tulihal, Wangching and Sapam. These airfields would provide the means by which the Imphal garrison would halt, defeat and pursue the Japanese divisions. At Imphal, there would be no distinct front line, rather defended areas with large gaps between, and the Japanese would be able to infiltrate easily off into the plain. No position would be safe from enemy attack, and everyone was a combatant. For the air forces, defences were organised around the headquarters of 221 Group, actually commanded by Air Commodore Vincent, who we saw earlier. There are also the airfields, the flying squadron dispersals, the aims and the signals facilities, and they all had to be defended. And this was the role of the Royal Air Force Regiment. Bunkers and slit trenches were dug, and small arms, ammunition and rations were allotted. Early on, it had been expected that air and ground crew would perform guard duty and provide backup to the RAF Regiment squadrons and flights. However, as the siege developed, it became clear that this was unsustainable, as they could not perform their highly skilled and technical roles by day and then remain alert at night. The role of the RAF Regiment was therefore essential if the RAF was to stick it out in the valley. You can imagine people who were working as ground corps, or even pilots who are flat out all day and then being given a rifle and told to sit in a trench and spend most of the night waiting for the enemy to attack. The first anti-aircraft flight was 4408, and it arrived in the valley in mid-1943, and it will remain there for the next 15 months. By March 1944, at the beginning of the siege, there were 1.5 field squadrons, 3 India and 12 AA flights present. By June, early July, at the end of the siege, there were 3.5 field squadrons, 3 India flights and 16 AA flights. So a significant number of the Royal Air Force Regiment were there in that siege. Other regiment squadrons and flights were also located outside the valley on the airfields to the west, and they were looking after aircraft that were supporting operations at Imphal. For example, 4416 and 4417 AA flights were protecting the Volti Vengeance dive bombers at Kumbhagram, and there were a large number of these airfields that were being looked after by the RAF Regiment. At one time, there was an RAF Regiment officer given to the Americans to look at some of the ground defence of the airfields up in the Assam Valley. Now, Henry Kirk's 2944 Field Squadron had been ordered to take over a hill feature, which was part of the defensive position known as Kipper Box. Henry Kirk stated, "I was the squadron armourer, and headquarters was a basher hut built into the hillside. Next door was the Chindits headquarters. Every part of the valley was split up into independent box defences. The outer defences of our box were a range of high hills, with the radio post D for Donald, 5,038 feet above sea level. D for Donald was the peak with the main radio transmitter for Imphal, and you can see it in the photo to the left there. Alongside, there's also an Ames as well. This afterwards got the nickname Nightmare Peak from the valley floor, as it was like looking at a wall. You had to put your head right back to see the tops, and on these heights our field squadrons had to dig in and fortify the area, and we muleteers had to supply all their needs. And you can see in the photos here on the slide, 2 gunners right at the top of Nightmare Peak, occupying gun positions and looking out over the valley. Henry's the person on the left there in the right-hand photo with his mule. And the thing that I find interesting in the photo at bottom left is it shows some of his squadron. There's an awful lot of people who are emaciated, probably poorly nourished, and also affected by mepicrin. But you'll notice second from left, there's a really quite well-built chap, and that turned out to be the squadron cook. So interpret what you can from that. There were two landlines on Nightmare Peak that followed the tracks up D for Donald. One went to 221 Group Headquarters and the other went to 4 Corps Headquarters. Any loss of either of them could have had serious consequences for the defenders of Imphal. The Royal Air Force Regiment gunners and the anti-aircraft flights had to be continually on the alert for Japanese fighters swooping in on strafing runs, medium to high altitude bombing and rumoured infantry attacks. For those manning the Brownings, there would only be a short warning period before enemy fighters streaked across the airstrip. The strafing attacks lasted only a few seconds and were often preceded by days or weeks where no enemy aircraft had appeared. There were periods of intense activity with warnings of air attack, signalled by 3 shots fired from an Army Bofors gun located on the strip. The warnings, red, yellow or white, occurred 2 or 3 times a day when the Japanese Air Force were active. 15 air raid warnings were given at Imphal, Maine during April, on occasions twice a day. Not all the jobs given to the regiment involved airfield defence, but nonetheless were important. The Armoured Fighting Vehicle Flight, one of which is shown here, belonging to 2943 Field Squadron, was lent to the 20th Indian Division to carry out patrols to help keep the road open to the forward positions on the Shenam Pass. And the infantry on the Shenam Pass were in close contact with the Japanese, both sides living in conditions similar to those of the Somme in the First World War. What's interesting is that, and quite frustrating, is that the operations record book for 2943 is completely missing for about 3 months of the siege, and I haven't been able to find out anything about the role of this armoured fighting vehicle flight. The only reason I know about it is that the Gurkhas mention it in their own history, and that's the only account I've been able to find. Very frustrating. The 2943 Field Squadron and the 4 AA flights that were stationed at Palel airstrip, June had passed in a similar manner to the previous 2 months of the siege, with constant manning of anti-aircraft positions interspersed with periods of enemy ground activity around the airstrip and the surrounding hills. In late June, however, the Japanese made their last effort to break through and capture Palel. During July, the local Japanese commander decided that a small but determined party of saboteurs would have a greater chance of reaching Palel main air base and the airfield. So 4444 anti-aircraft flight was ordered to abandon its anti-aircraft role and concentrate on the protection of aircraft in the dispersal days. The wire was strengthened and the listening posts were established. On the 5th of July, however, a small enemy party of 1 officer, Captain Inui Sakazo, and 13 men raided the Palel airstrip. An RAF Regiment patrol had heard sounds in the neighbourhood of 2 aircraft. On their approach, there were explosions in 4 other aircraft. They saw some men run away into the darkness and fired on them and followed. In the meantime, more members of the enemy party took advantage of the disturbance and came in behind them, placing their bombs in 3 Spitfires and making off immediately into the darkness to the south. While the raiding party had successfully achieved their aim, this period serves to emphasise the real and serious threat faced in protecting the aircraft on the ground, and the essential nature of the task being carried out by the Royal Air Force Regiment in close defence of the airstrips. The RAF Regiment units spent the entire siege on alert, and this was the only successful sabotage attempt on aircraft on the Imphal airfields. Captain Inui Sakazo would make one further sabotage raid on RAF aircraft at On Bork in central Burma in March 1945. However, this time he would fail in the attempt and lose his life when caught out by RAF Regiment gunners. Following the lifting of the siege of Imphal, the RAF Regiment underwent a further reorganisation. The 36-man anti-aircraft flights were brought back to the depot at Secunderabad and reformed into larger light anti-aircraft squadrons. And they were to be equipped with heavier 20mm Hispano cannon. You know, they're not getting Bofors guns. You know, it's the usual story with the Far East, is that you have very limited resources being given. The Army still had some Bofors guns, but the RAF Regiment could only get these smaller cannon. Other squadrons remained at Imphal and prepared for the coming advance into central Burma. While most of the 14th Army and 221 Group waited for the end of the monsoon, the 11th East African Division, shown here, were ordered to fight its way down the Kabul Valley. The Kabul Valley had a deserved reputation as one of the most disease-ridden places on Earth. A flight of 2941 Squadron trekked across the ranges from the valley to reach Moore Lake on the River Chinwan to protect an RAF radar station. RAF Regiment Squadrons were actually attached to battalions of the 11th East African Division and travelled down the valley, actually fighting alongside them, where they reached Kalemio at the southern end of the valley in December 1944. By January 1945, they'd formed what were called Wing Headquarters. This consisted of 1307, 1323 and 1324 Wing HQs, and they were to control groups of squadrons. They were in position alongside 221 Group Headquarters and on the divisions of 14th Army, and the 14th Army began moving forward in the last week of December, and the stage was set for the reconquest of Burma, which was known as Operation Capital and later Operation Extended Capital. For the first 2 months of 1945, the advance of the RAF Regiment Squadrons into central Burma was controlled by these wing headquarters, and there were a total of 9 squadrons. Along with the wing headquarters, the regiment also received much-needed reinforcements from the United Kingdom. In October 1944, 5 squadrons arrived and were quickly trained and acclimatised at Fort Echelon at Agartala. A further 8 squadrons followed. Many of the gunners could have been forgiven for thinking that with the war in Europe coming to an end, they would soon be returning to civilian life. Instead, in a few short weeks, they moved from the windswept RAF David Stowe Moor in Cornwall to the steamy jungles of Bengal, and for some, the central plain of Burma. And for some of those men, they would not come back. The regiment kept pace with the Army's advance. By early March 1945, the 14th Army were poised on the banks of the Irrawaddy. Despite their efforts, they knew that the Japanese armies in Burma were not defeated. The RAF Regiment fighting alongside 14th Army were at the very core of the struggle, and their actions would contribute in a small but vital manner to the success of Slim's Operation Extended Capital. As we recounted in the first slide, Meiktila was the key command and logistics centre of the Japanese army in Burma. The airfield located to the east of Meiktila was developed as the main air supply base for 17th Indian Division once it had been captured in its thrust across the Irrawaddy and towards Meiktila. The 99th Indian Infantry Brigade was initially given responsibility for defence of the airfield alongside the Royal Air Force Regiment, and it was ordered to hold it as a secure base from which the division could operate. Wing Commander Bill Lander, shown here with the large moustache in the bottom right photo, of 1307 Wing Headquarters, received orders in late February to prepare for the Meiktila operation. On the 1st of March, as 17th Indian Division approached Meiktila, the squadrons and flights under his command were readied. A force consisting of 2708 Squadron, one of the UK squadrons, 2 anti-aircraft flights of 2963 Squadron, and a flight each of 2941 and 2968 were flown in over the next few days. The defenders were concentrated in D-Box, a barbed wire enclosed area on the western side of the airfield, and we can see that this red area here with the 2 airstrips. The blue areas, of course, are the concentration of the Japanese forces, and you can see these arrows starting to point towards the airfield. The gunners were met by small arms fire as they landed and were quickly moved into the box. The commander of the thinly stretched 99th Brigade was particularly grateful for the arrival of the fresh troops of 2708 Squadron. Fortunately, Lander had kept a daily diary of his time at Meiktila, so we have a very good account of what happened over the next few days. Lander personally led patrols, not appropriate for his rank, but nonetheless he wanted to be fully appraised of the situation. What had become apparent was that while the Japanese had initially been beaten back, they were now concentrating their forces to the east of the airfield and were planning to recapture it. As the days passed, the frequency and size of attacks increased, as did the intensity of shelling. For the defenders of D-Box, the shelling was particularly unpleasant in such a confined space, and at one point a shell actually hit the RAF Regiment Headquarters, killing and wounding a number of officers and senior NCOs. Despite this, the airfield had to be kept open, and each morning the RAF Regiment gunners of 2708 Squadron moved out to clear the airstrips of enemy parties. On the night of 15th and 16th of March, the box came under attack, and enemy parties were heard moving about to the north of the strip. At sunrise that morning, 2 flights moved off through a gap in the barbed wire, and this is where we were in the first slide. Considerable courage was required to move out onto the flat, featureless airstrip which lacked any cover. Sergeant Norman Gerrish, shown here, was leading one flight, Flying Officer Furlong the other. Moving in an extended line, they crossed the full length of the runway and came under intense machine gun and mortar fire. A section were pinned down on the runway. What happens next is best recounted in the citation for Norman Gerrish's military medal. Sergeant Gerrish was in charge of a rifle flight during an action at Meiktila airstrip, which the enemy had infiltrated at night. He sustained a leg wound early in the battle, but he rallied his men, taking over a light machine gun and returning the enemy fire with good effect, causing casualties. When his ammunition was expended, he took over another gun and ran forward to a position from which he could cover the withdrawal of the flights. His fire was so effective that all personnel were able to cross open ground and reach cover. Only then did Sergeant Gerrish make his way across the airstrip in full view of the enemy. His courage, determination and leadership were instrumental in holding 2 companies of the Japanese and for their ultimate defeat, during which 20 of the enemy were killed. This airman set a magnificent example in the face of strong opposition. The cost, however, had been heavy for the RAF regiment, with 7 airmen being killed and 9 wounded. The regiment were at Meiktila for more than 3 weeks. The continued enemy attacks eventually forced the closure of the airfield, but Lander continued to lead patrols. On the 24th of March, the struggle reached its climax. The dawn patrol was led by Lander and consisted of 2708 Squadron and an Indian battalion of the 9th Charts. The enemy opened fire and the patrol were pinned down, with both of the infantry commanders wounded. There was the crack of a sniper rifle, and Lander fell, shot through the head. His runner, LAC Dakers, was fatally hit at the same time. A Bofors gun crew saw the flash of a rifle from a nearby palm tree. Sighting the Bofors and firing, the top half of the tree disintegrated, and a body was seen to fall from it. Lander's and Dakers' bodies had to be left as the patrol withdrew, and they were only recovered a few days later. There were plenty of volunteers who were wanting to go out and recover them, but that was refused. The following appreciation was written by those who served under Wing Commander Lander. He was by any standard an outstanding officer, superb in leadership, full of energy and enthusiasm, well liked and respected by all who served with him. He was 30 years old when killed. 2 days later, on the 28th of March, the enemy attack ceased. The Japanese had been savagely mauled and they were ordered to withdraw. The battle for, capture of and successful defence of Meiktila was a significant milestone in the defeat of the Japanese. Meiktila is one of the RAF Regiment's proudest battle honours. For the 270 airmen present during the siege, the casualties were high. 14 airmen were killed and 25 were wounded. 50 airmen were evacuated due to sickness, slight wounds, and there were cases of nervous exhaustion. Final words should be left to Squadron Leader Ginger Lacey, the Battle of Britain fighter ace, and commanding officer of 17 Spitfire Squadron. They began flying patrols from the Meiktila airfield soon after its capture. He said, "The RAF regiment won bloody renown in the fierce fighting for repossession of the landing ground every humid morning. One day that the squadron remembers, one of the aircraft dispersal bays was full of the bodies of RAF regiment officers and men awaiting burial." While this was going on in central Burma, 15 Corps were actually carrying out a series of amphibious landings at Akiab, Ramri and Mayabon down in the southern Arakan. And again, RAF regiment squadrons fully participated in those operations. I won't be able to go into that, but there's a few good accounts of that. Finally, it was decided that with Slim's army coming down from the north, that 15 Corps would carry out an amphibious landing to capture the Burmese capital of Rangoon. And again, RAF regiment squadrons participated in that operation. As you will know about the landing Operation Dracula, it was occurred under pretty awful conditions. Here you can see them pulling their Hispano anti-aircraft guns off the landing craft, and another shot of them coming into the docks at Rangoon. The aim of the RAF regiment, though, was to get as fast as they could to RAF Meiktila. And you'll see here the Hispano guns being towed towards the Shwedagon Pagoda. And on the right here, this shows some Japanese officers coming into surrender later, a few weeks later. And on the right-hand side here is Captain Randall Mannering, who was a Royal Air Force Regiment officer. The middle painting here is done by Frank Whitten, the famous aviation artist. And most people will be interested in the plane that's flying here. But for those associated with the RAF Regiment, this is a Hispano 20mm cannon. So they managed to appear. However, it wasn't over for the RAF Regiment squadrons. With the Japanese surrender on the 15th of August, it was now necessary to liberate those colonies still occupied by enemy troops. 2896 Squadron, another UK squadron, arrived in Singapore by sea in early September as part of Operation Tide Race, forming part of the main occupation force. 24 hours later, this single squadron had taken responsibility for all 4 major airfields on the island. Other squadrons were earmarked for Operation Zipper, which was the amphibious landings in Malaya. They were actually a complete disaster, and luckily they were unopposed, and so it could have been far worse for those people. The regiment landed and took control of Penang and Georgetown. 2 of these squadrons became the first Allied units to cross the causeway into Singapore from the north. That was since the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders had withdrawn across it with their pipes playing just prior to the fall of the fortress in 1942. On the 12th of September, 2896 Field Squadron provided the Royal Air Force component of a joint service guard of honour at the signing of the instrument of surrender by the Japanese at the Municipal Building in Singapore. An armed guard represented each of the Allies. Prior to the ceremony, the Guard of Honour were inspected by Lord Louis Mountbatten, the Supreme Commander of Southeast Asia Command. Following the inspection, he moved into the Municipal Building for the surrender ceremony. However, before proceedings began, Mountbatten had noticed that there was no representative of the RAF regiment in the chamber. A request was sent out by Mountbatten to the CO of 2896 Squadron for an airman to come in to witness the signing. Corporal W. Vance, the smartest airman on parade, was sent in. The official photograph taken at the time is well known, but few realise the context of why an RAF regiment airman stands prominently to attention in the near background. And we can see in this middle photo by the white pillar in the centre back, an RAF regiment Corporal Vance standing there. Despite the war ending, the Royal Air Force Regiment still required, the Royal Air Force still required the Royal Air Force Regiment. As well as Malaya and Singapore, the squadrons were sent to Hong Kong, Thailand, French Indochina, and the Netherlands East Indies to take the surrender of the Japanese forces. Furthermore, nationalist insurgencies were breaking out in the later two countries, and more airmen were to lose their lives. The numbers of airmen gradually reduced as their war service ended, and they returned home. Many squadrons could not be maintained and were gradually run down. Finally, in April 1947, 2810 Parachute Field Squadron became the last of the Southeast Asia Command regiment squadrons to be disbanded, and thus no squadron numbers were retained from the Burma campaign. This decision meant to this day no formal battle honours can be carried by the Royal Air Force Regiment from the Far Eastern War. Arguably the most profound effect of the reorganisation of the RAF Regiment in Southeast Asia Command was the development of a strong esprit de corps, high morale, comradeship, and a sense of purpose amongst the officers and airmen, and that exists to this day. This was again eloquently put by Sir Keith Park, the New Zealand Commander of Air Command in Southeast Asia. If the RAF Regiment in Southeast Asia has done nothing, he said, more than provide vital protection to our airfields, the record of its achievements would still read with commendable credit. That it was able to perform further additional services and maintain a smartness and discipline which called forth praise from Army and Navy alike demonstrates the value of our regiment as an adjunct of the Royal Air Force. In many tours and inspections throughout this theatre, I've noticed the almost jealous-like pride which the regiment squadrons have in their own service. That the regiment was able to carry out its tasks so effectively and efficiently, despite inadequate numbers, outdated equipment, and often with a significant proportion of the unit debilitated with tropical ailments, is a tribute to the diligence, tenacity, persistence, and professionalism of its officers and airmen. The Royal Air Force, and in particular Air Command Southeast Asia, could not have asked more of the men of its youngest corps. Now, I had that quote at the beginning about constant vigilance, and I used that when I write my book, which Sylvia mentioned. And you should get a copy, because even Aung San Suu Kyi has one. So if she's got one, I think you should go and buy one. So thank you very much.
Yeah, well done. Thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely fabulous. This will become very sought after now, so make sure you get a copy before they all disappear into the ether. A couple of questions for you before we go, Nigel. The first one is from Steve Rothwell. And the question is, from your book, we know that the RAF Regiment deployed anti-aircraft units for airfield defence, etc., etc. I wonder what level of integration or cooperation was in place between the RAF Regiment and the Army anti-aircraft gunners.
So as far as from what my reading is that they would actually coordinate with those gunners. So I've got layout plans for the RAF Regiment around these airfields, and they always have on their maps the heavy anti-aircraft 3.7s or the Bofors guns around them, and they would work out fire arcs and so on. One of the issues with the Hispano cannon that they received was that it wasn't self-destroying ammunition. So if you fired it, it didn't go up and explode. It actually came down somewhere. So you had to be very, very careful where you were firing to ensure that you didn't actually kill people on your own side around the airfield. So I'm sure there would have been pretty good integration. One thing to note, though, is compared with probably the European theatre, the number of Bofors guns and heavy anti-aircraft guns would have been far smaller than you would have found in those theatres.
The question from me is, yes, so Orlikins and so on, 20, 25 millimeter, 40 millimeter, not many of them. What about 5-inch Brownings? There would have been a suite of them with it.
So the RAF Regiment were given the .303 twin Brownings. That was their initial weaponry.
Yeah.
The .5 was never considered, and they didn't actually have them. There were units of the RAF armoured cars in the Middle East that got hold of .5 Brownings, which would have come off damaged aircraft, but I've never actually seen an RAF Regiment gunner in the Far East with a .5.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed. And a final question from David Fox. Did the RAF have its own pioneers or engineers to repair after airfield damage, or was that done by the Royal Engineers?
In the Far East, most of that would have been done by, I would imagine, by Indian engineers and so on, because there was this huge workforce that had been recruited in India to actually carry a lot of those actions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Nigel. We've run out of time, so let's hand back to Sylvia and move on to there we are.
Well, brilliant. Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Nigel. What a brilliant walk through this even lesser known part of a forgotten army, and a great subject to add to our growing library of webinars, all available on our website for posterity. As some of you will already know, this year's Kohima commemoration service in York will be held on Thursday, the 26th of June. We are just in the process of preparing the booking forms, and I know some of you are writing in to ask. These will go out hopefully in the next couple of weeks, along with invitation letters and, as I say, the booking forms for you to arrange your tickets. For those of you who have not attended this event in previous years, it is a marvellous day when families of veterans come together in the Dean's Garden at York Minster, when the Dean will lead a service of commemoration and remembrance. Our speaker this year is the Chaplain General, the Reverend Canon M. Parker, and as always we are ably supported by the 2nd Signal Regiment, who will host us at lunch at the barracks after the service. The Kohima Museum, of course, will be open all afternoon, as always. We're also organising an event on the evening prior to the service, which we hope will be held at York University. Our intention is, on this 80th anniversary of VJ Day and the end of the war in the Far East, to bring you stories from all who fought there. Encouraged by your wonderful support of our Book of Remembrance ideas, we want to replicate this as a live event, supported with video and readings. We will also launch the Book of Remembrance that week. Thank you to everyone who has trusted us with their stories, and we are doing our best to honour these memories. Should you still wish to contribute, our cut-off date is the end of next week. The other project we're working on is to appeal to any Naga students living outside of India who need assistance with any training or further education. We're still unable to transfer money to India, so we want to reach out to Nagas living abroad. Now, in our shop, we have some new titles available, and Richard Duckett's popular SOE in Burma. I've now got some copies if you would like to buy one. And we've also, I'd like to give a quick plug for this wonderful book privately published, the 2nd Battalion Royal Norfolk Regiment at Kohima, where we've got copies to sell. It's been written and researched by a lady called Hazel Mindham, who's done it all of her own accord and free of charge, all proceeds being donated to the Royal Norfolk Regiment United Charities. And as I say, KET have purchased a few copies from them, and any sale from our website, those profits will go to KET, just for clarity. Excellent. So our next webinar will be on the 20th of April, when Liz Lockhart-Muir will talk about her mother's experiences in the Women's Auxiliary Service in Burma, and as told in her book, From Frontline to Fortitude, something we are all looking forward to very much. But in the meantime, thank you very much for joining us this evening, and I wish you a very good night. Thank you.